Hello, and welcome to AWS Review, a weekly look at what's happening with AWS and how it may change your business. My name is Michael Krause. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Charter Solutions, where we help organizations change and innovate quickly by accelerating their acquisition and use of data.
And I'm your co-host, John Affolter. I'm a lead technical architect and AWS specialist at Salesforce, where I work with potential customers, helping them envision the possibilities that AWS and Salesforce enables.
Excellent. Well, John, welcome back for another episode.
Yeah.
The last few episodes, we've been chatting a little bit about weather, and I've been wanting to change that up, except for the fact that this last few days, it's felt like Minnesota's trying to go back into winter again.
Yeah, I think it's pretty crazy. I think, every time we do this, we might be jinxing ourselves, but I think, today it's beautiful out. I got to go on a little walk here this morning, and I was thinking, wow, it's maybe this is the last one, but 50 degrees in May. I'm kind of wishing that the global warming would happen here in just Minnesota only.
Absolutely. Now you're in your third week at Salesforce now?
Yeah, I think technically fourth, but my first week was just one day. So yeah, this is pretty much week 3. So
how's it going?
Yeah, I mean, things are going, fast and furious, I like to say. So, through the boot camp, through all the trainings, but that's just kind of the beginning stuff. And now I have to, dive into some of the more specialized stuff that we're doing. And, but things are moving along well, and getting to meet a lot of the sales folks that I'm going to be working with, also folks on the AWS side as well. So, things are going well. So
excellent.
But yeah, I mean, I think I'm really excited to keep things moving along. But I think now the real fun starts. So here we go. But if before we move on to the topic here, which is event-driven systems on AWS, which I'm really excited about, let's take a little bit of a look into what happened last week at AWS.
Excellent. So maybe I'll kick it off with AWS has released their distro for OpenTelemetry now as a generally available solution for metrics. So now people who are using OpenTelemetry or have been using Open Tracing and are planning to move to OpenTelemetry can start taking advantage of that. It's really cool because it allows you to use an open API for adding tracing into your code that runs on Lambda, runs on ECS, etc., and route it to tools like Amazon X-Ray, Datadog, other tracing systems that are out there, providing lots of visibility. And this is a really important type of technology for people who may not be familiar with it. Because when you move to things like Amazon Web Services, you find yourself in a highly distributed environment. You have multiple pieces of code running independent of each other. You may have what you normally would have thought of as a transaction that is actually being executed by multiple different systems to complete the whole end-to-end piece. And tools like OpenTelemetry allow you to tie all of that together and get a better view of what's happening inside your distributed platform.
I think this is a really big update and kind of really serendipitous of the time within event-driven systems. So, kind of a really good, funny timing. It's almost like AWS was listening to us. So,
yep, absolutely.
I think this is definitely a huge update. So, I guess I'll jump into the next one here. So, Amazon Athena now supports Ion datasets. So, Amazon Athena, the interactive query service. So now you can leverage Amazon Ion data format, which is pretty amazing. It really allows you to have a dual format interoperability. So you can really take advantage of the ease of use of text format, but while also utilizing the efficiency of binary. So It extends all those JSON capabilities and does it in a self-describing format. And so then you can have open content discovery. So you can really lean on schema evolution, and you can have everything talking to each other. And yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, JSON is not going anywhere. And if you can match that up with the ability to leverage the binary format, I think you've really kind of have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, so kind of gives you something along the lines of the flexibility of JSON with the compactness and performance of Google protobufs in a highly extensible format that's supported by AWS. And now Athena can query it.
Yeah, which is makes life pretty easy, especially when you're looking to do some of those ad hoc and trying to find some insights on the fly here. So definitely a great update as well.
Excellent. So the final kind of note for today, and it's not really a big update, really just more of a heads up that coming in June, Amazon is going to be releasing an updated dashboard experience for Amazon QuickSight. So take a look. Starting June 30th, they're going to be releasing some new things like a simplified toolbar, a more discoverable visual menu, more polished controls and menus and submenus, and a non-blocking right pane for secondary experiences like filters and thresholds and stuff. So keep your eyes open for that. It's out on the AWS blog if you want to go take a look at what they've got so far.
Yeah, another great update. Another QuickSight's doing stuff really quickly, and anything that they can do to improve kind of that experience, I think they're really making some big leaps forward here.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, let's get to the meat of the conversation today. Today we're going to be taking a look at event-driven systems on AWS. This is kind of an introductory topic, kind of a prelude to some upcoming deeper conversations we're going to have on tools like Event Bridge, event-driven data processing as a path to real-time analytics and application integration. So this will kind of, hopefully for people who may not be as familiar with event-driven systems, give them a understanding of what it is and what's available on AWS. And before we dive deeply into it, I just want to pause for a moment and do a little bit of kind of housekeeping. Next Monday is a holiday. We will not be having a session next Monday, but we will be picking up the Monday after.
Great. So, Michael, I guess, we'll start off. What are event-driven systems?
So, but before diving into the deep technical definitions of event-driven, let's talk about it from a concept level at first. And the way I like to think about it is that you've got a couple of types of control within systems, right? And you can think about the same thing inside corporations. You've got centralized control where you've got, a system, a person who is divvying out work. John, I want you to do this. Michael, I want you to go do this now, right? You've got somebody who's divvying out that work, and it creates a certain centralized level of control. The decentralized level of control, and this is kind of the event-driven system analogy, is rather than saying, John, I want you to go do something, I raise a note and say, hey, this has happened. This thing has happened. We've received a piece of mail, whatever it might be. And then all parties who are interested in it take their independent actions upon it when that happens, right? So I was kind of thinking about, what's a good analogy that maybe a lot of people would understand. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had some fairly severe storms come through Minnesota, including tornadoes. And I was at home, and a tornado warning went off, and that tornado warning went off, and it was on the radio, it was on TV, it came across my phone, it came across Amazon Alexa, but it didn't tell me what I needed to do necessarily. It just, it did say take cover, all this stuff. But different audiences had to do different things. So people, if you're at home, you need to go to your basement or take cover, things like that. People in emergency services have to prepare to go out and deal with the potential cleanup and post tornado issues and things like that. But the event is the tornado warning, right? A tornado has been sighted. And now That's all they're really letting you know. That's the event. And then all the different interested parties go and take the appropriate behaviors they need to take when they see that event.
Yeah, I actually was in a couple of those tornadoes myself. One here at my apartment, and then one in the car on the way up north. So,
Oh,
to your
ouch.
point, Michael, when I was at my apartment, I went down into the parking garage, but when I was in the car, I was kind of stuck in the back. So we would have pulled under a bridge, but I wasn't driving, so they just kept on driving on through. So I guess
Sad,
there's
sad.
a good analogy of where the disconnect could happen depending on what events you need to take here.
Right. So kind of to flip it into the technology world, event-driven systems in software are really about, rather than taking tight control and clearly orchestrating and making calls to say, okay, I need you to go do this, and now I need you to go do this. It flips it on its head and says, hey, this has happened, right? I've received this new data. And here's maybe some metadata, some information about this data to help you understand what it is. And you may have other software systems that need to do something with that data. You may have another software system that doesn't care. So for example, you might have a transactional system that has to update their records based on that data. You may have an analytics system that needs to take that data and process it into their data warehouse for analysis purposes, right? And all of this can happen from that same singular event.
Yeah, and I think a good point too with that is that can kick off a bunch of events, and to your point, once it gets processed in that data, now that data, depending on what happens in that process, can kick off a whole nother set of events therefore after. So
Yeah. Well,
you
and
can get pretty
that's
crazy.
kind of the event cascade, right?
Yep.
So it's the transactional system may have an event that says, hey, I've got a user record that's now been updated. Right. And there may be other systems that whenever user record is updated, oh, now we need to go and maybe, update some information in the identity management system for that user or other types of things. So, the event driven system allows a much looser coupling. In a tightly coupled system, if you're not using events, you're creating a scenario where the person who has the event, who has that information, needs to know about who needs to do things with them and has to have at least some sort of general idea what to do, right? I have to call this API and this guy, and then I have to call this API over here, and then I have to drop a file over here for these people. When we flip it to event driven, they don't care. It's opaque. They're the outside systems that are subscribing to it. They don't care what it is. They just have a standardized format to say, here's the event and here's data related to it. You guys figure out what you need to do with it.
Absolutely. And we can just think about kind of the evolution that we've gone through, from going from monolithic applications to service oriented architectures and then into event driven. How do you kind of manage that, and how do you get a little of the best of both worlds with the event driven systems, but still being able to have with some things that centralized control and some of the challenges around that? And maybe we don't jump right into that, but I think that's something to think about, that it's it's definitely a challenge to
Yeah.
that event cascading, as you said.
Yeah, I think that's a good, as good as any place to go next, which is, there's both benefits and challenges to an event-driven system. The benefits are things like loose couplings. I can introduce an entire new system into the process that needs to do stuff with that event without changing whoever is going and collecting it, right? So let's use the idea of data ingestion for analytics, right? I may have a system that pulls data from salesforce.com, right?
Mhm.
And I want to, make it available for analysis. So normally I would, maybe take it in, drop it in S3, run a glue job on it, load it into Redshift. But rather than that, what I might do is say, oh, I've got this new record, and make it available to whomever. And then I might have a curation process or an ETL-ish type process that is interested in that record, puts it in the data warehouse. Well, now I might have a piece of software, an application, maybe a user-facing application, who also is very interested in that record.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have to go to my original system that's pulling that data out of Salesforce and say, okay, not only do you have to send it over here, you send it over here. With the event-driven system, I just subscribe, to use the term loosely, to that same event type from this new system. And now both the analytics platform and this new system get notified when that event's there, and they can both process it, right? So it's easy to kind of extend who all needs to do work with that or do something with that event. But the downside is it's less controlled and less traceable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as the person raising the event, I don't know who's taking that event and doing something with it,
Yes.
right? So if there's a problem, it's harder to trace,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is why, the announcement about the open telemetry stuff is real important, because, now you can, using tools like that, you can build tracing in and have, oh, I've created this event. And then if you've got 2 or 100 different consumers, all of them can write out information saying, I'm processing this event, or I tried to process the event and I failed, or nobody ever got the event. So there's no information out there. I'm producing some and nothing's consuming it. Right. So you need that observability in order to be able to verify that it's happening. Right. So as much as I would love to say, gosh, event-driven systems are lovely and beautiful, and we should make everything as event-driven as possible and self-organizing, it really becomes problematic on the maintenance and troubleshooting side, right? And more tools are helping there, but there's still a big challenge.
Obviously that's something that you've kind of introduced Datadog with, and I know I kind of wanted to save this question near towards the end, but what are your thoughts on just observability and how tools like Datadog work, and really maybe what does this update mean for AWS and its ability to do some of that observability that that Datadog is doing?
Yeah, so this is a little bit kind of a side to the topic of the day, but this is fine, because it is important as part of this, because if companies want to go down the event driven path, and I'll make the statement here, most companies should, but not necessarily for everything, right? It's picking the right tool for the job is the critical piece here. But if you're moving to the cloud, moving to AWS, if you're looking at going down event-driven paths or starting to go down that event-driven path, observability is critical, right? Tools like Datadog, tools like CloudFormation, tools like X-Ray provide a certain amount of default observability, but what they provide is observability on interactions of different systems at the highest level, right? So I might be able with X-Ray to see that a Lambda was invoked and the Lambda put something on an SQS queue, and that SQS queue message was picked up by someone else. But I can't see what's happening inside the Lambda in that trace. I can't see really what's happening inside the thing that picked that message up off the queue inside the trace. So the open telemetry type tools allow you to build, basically wrap chunks of code. They call it a span in a tag that says, all right, here we're doing this. And then that allows you to enhance what's being traced. So you get visibility into the behaviors of the code, not just the behaviors of the subsystems themselves.
Absolutely. Well, before I take us too far off the beaten path, let's talk about some of the event-driven systems that AWS utilizes and how those might be implemented in your architecture.
Sure. So the first one I want to talk about is something that most people who've done development on AWS already is aware of and is most likely using, which is the inherent events that AWS creates, right? So you drop a file in an S3 bucket, you have the option of raising an event from that, and thereby triggering a Lambda that can then process that file or things like that. That's a pattern we see all the time, right? Drop a file, trigger a Lambda, and that's an event that AWS is propagating out there. A new file has arrived in S3.
Yep.
Right. And anybody who's interested in that fact that file arrived can do that. right? Now, they provide that same kind of eventing function for a lot of different things, SNS and SNS subscriptions, right? You can subscribe to an SNS topic, simple notification service, and when a new item goes on that topic, an event will come to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very nice if you think about Lambda, which is primarily an event-driven uh, code execution platform. Um, Makes it really nice to get Lambdas working. But if you think back to some of the issues that S3 originally had, is you could have for one particular key prefix in S3 only one event raised,
Mm-hmm.
right? And only one subscriber for that event, right? So it's like, well, I could go Lambda, but if I had two Lambdas I needed to trigger, I had one that actually did processing and maybe one that did some specific logging of information around that file. What you had to do is actually send that event to an SNS topic and have all the Lambdas subscribe to the SNS topic. So SNS became kind of a tool that allowed us to open up the broadcasting of events. And SNS has now added things like filters, which allows you to express that I'm only interested in events that match a certain criteria.
Yeah,
Right? So that minimizes noise that's coming down the stream towards you.
absolutely.
Another technology that has actually changed a lot over the last few years is Amazon Event Bridge.
Yeah.
So originally, when Amazon Event Bridge came out, its real usefulness was in getting data from external systems into AWS as events, right? So I'll use Salesforce again as an opportunity, right? A new contact is added to Salesforce. I want to be able to trigger a Lambda on that. So it was really kind of an external integration tool
Yep.
when it first was released. But what they've done is they've taken this whole event processing concept and said, we really need a true rich event bus.
Yeah.
So now they have evolved AWS Event Bridge to become much more of a true event bus. So you can create your own custom buses that you can send events to. Consumers of those events can subscribe using they use the term rules that allow you to filter based on metadata about the event and filter based on the content itself. They also, and I don't want to go too deep here because we're probably going to do an upcoming session on this.
Mm-hmm.
They have multiple ways of invoking the subscriber.
Yep.
So if you have a subscriber who is a Lambda, right, I can have the Lambda just be invoked by Event Bridge, right? If I want to put a buffer between the Event Bridge and my consumer, say I have an ECS container who wants to read off an SQSQ, I can have Event Bridge deliver those things to an SQSQ.
Yep.
If I have an application that has a REST API, I can actually have Event Bridge based on that rule and that subscription call an API. So there's a very rich set of things that you can do. And you can create your own custom events that you send to it, but you can also route AWS events through it as well.
Yeah, and I think an important thing too is when you kick off things within a lot of the AWS services, you're not getting charged either. So I think that's an important factor as well.
Yep.
But yeah, I still remember, Michael, I think we were talking maybe a year and a half ago about Event Bridge, and I kept telling you, I said, I keep seeing this in blogs, and I feel like they're really pushing towards Event Bridge here. And
Yep.
I still remember talking about it with you over probably a year and a half ago at this point. But
yeah, and I think we've both been watching it for a while, and it's finally, kind of evolved to a point where it's become a good solid tool to use for enabling more of the event kind of driven processing within AWS.
So, Michael, I always like to ask you questions about, companies that want to make an evolution and move towards event driven. What are some of the things that they need to think about when they're moving from a monolithic or service oriented architecture, or what are some of those things that they need to think about to make that move? And also, let's say you're in event driven, and maybe you want to take things into a different, maybe it's not, maybe certain parts of the application or certain parts aren't really, geared towards event driven. How do you make the switches either towards or away, if you're an event driven architecture or moving towards that?
So, it's easy to talk about the technology and get kind of wrapped up in the technology and say,
Yeah.
oh, you need to learn Event Bridge, you need to learn,
Yep.
SNS or SQS, you need to learn Lambda, you need to learn, how to scale to zero on ECS Fargate.
Mhm.
But the reality is, you need to learn how to think differently first, right? So if you're coming from a SOA kind of perspective, where most of your stuff, you're kind of pseudo microservice with high orchestration
Yep.
or choreography in there, or a monolithic application, where you're not doing event driven stuff even inside the monolith. There's a mindset change, right? And the mindset's more than just event. The mindset's distributed systems as well, right?
Yep.
So, like what we were talking about earlier, how are you going to handle the observability aspects? How are you going to support the operations people who have to watch this run and find out why it's not working? Um, what's the right way to break up your services? How are you going to think about transactionality, right? If I have a data change that occurs, where's the boundary of that transaction, right? You can dive into acid versus cap theorem, right?
Yep.
Does it need to be an acid transaction, or is it okay if we're, eventually consistent across all the systems that interact, right? If I've got 3 independent systems that all need to be updated in an acid type transaction, now I have got a different scenario that I have to deal with, rather than maybe I have one that needs that, and then I've got 2 or 3 other downstream systems that need to be updated, but they don't need to be updated right away, right? In the first one, I have to find a way to coordinate something across all of those so that I can get all the updates done or recover from that through compensation if something fails in the process. But if I only have one system that needs to be truly transactional and the rest can be eventually consistent, then that other system could actually raise an event and say, all right, I have finished updating this record. Boom, that's out there. And then I could have a dozen different downstream systems who, over the next fraction of a second to a few seconds, respond to the event and make changes themselves. So you need to think through these a lot more carefully. It's not as simple as, ooh, well, let's go event driven, right?
Yeah.
And let's go learn the specific tools that'll help me actually implement it. There's a lot of thinking around it. And there are times where you don't want to use event driven systems. There are times where you want to go all event driven, and there's times where you want to mix because you need certain level of choreography or orchestration. But at the same time, you need that pluggable flexibility to be able to add other pieces into the process.
Yeah, I think about a former client, and I think, one part was in charge of like the enterprise, and another part was in charge of customer experience. And they're like, yeah, we're just, add another stream. It'd be no big deal. But, at one point, does that just get out of hand? And, kind of being able to think about that from a business standpoint, and also, to your point, all the other people that have to worry about it, that if something goes wrong and track and trace that through all that event, that can definitely be a challenge.
Yeah.
Uh, what are your thoughts on, on having event driven architectures, and have those feed into streams, and then also the enrichment of maybe events, and some of the strategies around enriching events into another stream, or maybe.
Right. So, I may think about this a little bit differently than some people because I see an enriched event as a different event,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right? Um, and I may not be interested in an event before it's enriched, but I may be interested after, right? Which is, in my mind, where you need to start building kind of an ontology of your events and make sure people understand what that event represents from a state perspective, and allow people to subscribe to things at the right point. a particular information. So let's go back to the data and analytics perspective of I ingest data from Salesforce, right? And rather than doing a nightly batch of I'm going to go out to Salesforce and I'm going to download, all the new contacts and changed contacts and then update my data warehouse with them, I'm going to build a mechanism that allows anytime anybody clicks the save button on a contact, whether it's new or it's edited, that generates an event that we pick up, and we can now take that one contact and process them and update our analytics system, right? So that's one stream. So in a traditional business world, analytics and product development are typically separate.
Mm-hmm.
So if product development for some reason needs access to that same information, well, they'll go and build their integration with Salesforce and build that out, right? And you may not have a whole nother group that's doing the same thing. It's the same data we're looking at. But because the organization has allowed themselves to be siloed over time, and that used to be the most efficient way of doing, analytics and application development and back office IT stuff, you fell into this point-to-point type integration. So when you look at it and you say, okay, the reality is we should just really touch this data once if we can. So we may come in and we may say, oh, we got this new contact record from Salesforce, and create an event that allows various parties to know. And in that event, a software product that we're building may be interested in that raw event. So they'll subscribe to that. Plus, we also have an analytics process that is interested in that. But what it wants to do is create a much richer piece of information.
Mm-hmm.
So that event may go into that side and be processed, more information added to it and sent on, right? And in reality, how this event gets moved around, there's a lot of different ways. We've talked about Event Bridge. We've talked about SNS. We haven't talked about things like Kafka or Kinesis, right? Streaming platforms, right?
Yep.
So in those same spots, that event is just a record, and there are people interested in it. That event could go onto a Kinesis data stream and be picked up by multiple people on the other end of that Kinesis data stream, right? And processed out as well. It could go into a Kinesis data stream, be picked up by a Lambda, enriched, and passed on further. It could be dropped into S3, triggering a glue job, which goes and pulls data from, a Snowflake database and Redshift and pulls it all together and creates another file in an S3 bucket, which then creates another event that people might be interested in, that richer file set, right? Now we've enriched that so that can be a feed into a machine learning application.
Yep.
Right. So the idea here is, and this kind of goes back to one of the earliest live streams that you and I did, which is around the convergence of cloud data application development, right? Yep. So when you think about this, we're not saying, here's a work stream for product development, here's a work stream for analytics, and never the twain shall meet, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking at it and saying, I have data coming in that I have multiple constituents who are interested in that data. I have enrichments of that data that are going to occur that I have multiple constituents who are interested in that data. And that's where the event-driven aspects really become handy, because now you're looking at it and saying, oh, guess what? I now have available to me a new piece of data that I can act upon that meets my personal criteria.
Yep. I mean, you went exactly the direction I was hoping you were going to go with. So you're in my head with that. So yeah, I think, it's really interesting to have all these different streams of data. And, I guess, what are some of the best ways, just from maybe just an overall, I guess, process piece of just being able to organize this and just being able to really be able to accelerate the use across these different teams? Because to your point, is you used to have analytics in one group here, and then a product team that might be utilizing analytics, utilizing data from different sources to create one kind of product that's encapsulated with all of these different aspects. how do you organize that in a great way, especially with event driven? What's
Yeah.
the real architecture or process or cataloging? What does that look like?
I'd love to say, I've got the 5-step ebook that you can download that tells you exactly everything you need to do on this.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a lot more complicated than that, right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, one of the things that companies have been going through is an evolution in how they approach technology, right? So, I talk to a lot of people about the need to be innovative, the need to be adaptable, and the need to be able to do things in an attainable way so that you're not constantly cycling and going into the analysis paralysis kind of thing. So, I'm going to walk through kind of what I've been seeing out there because there's implications, and I think people need to understand that this it's not an easy road, but it is an important road. And
Mhm.
people need to be making small investments now to get them ready next year to take bigger investments and next year to get bigger investments to be going down this path. So many, many years ago, and I can't remember the name of it, but there was a competitor to kind of the Tomcat and other kind of, web application
Mhm.
platforms that was purely event driven inside the platform itself. So events were created, you responded to events, and they were actually able to prove a lot of performance from a standpoint of handling more concurrent transactions in that system than
Mhm.
in a traditional kind of just standard multi-threaded platform. Um, so in that world, we were dealing with a single system and looking at how do we leverage event-based mechanisms in that system to get better performance and to get better flexibility, to be able to inject new functionality quickly without having to rewrite entire orchestrations or choreographies.
Mhm.
So what's happened as people are going to the cloud is we've gone from that single process, that single piece of code, now to multiple pieces of code. And how do we event amongst those things and get that working? And people are now starting to wrap their heads around it, starting to wrap their heads around the distributed nature of it, things like that. What you're asking about is the next level.
Mhm.
And the next level is crossing organizational boundaries, whether it's boundaries within a product organization, boundaries between product and back office IT and analytics, but the true convergence of analytics, app dev, cloud, all of these things coming together. That's what you're asking about. And the
Mhm.
starting point there isn't technology. The starting point there is strategy and culture
Mhm.
change, right?
Yep.
Because now you need to build a strategy that you can start pursuing that says we're only going to ingest a piece of data once into this organization, and there will be only one place we ingest that. And everybody who wants to use it, that's the path. And we will make sure that data is available and that it comes through in a timely manner, so that everybody can leverage it. But that also means now, gee, the product team's been doing this really cool stuff with AWS and events in AWS. The analytics team is still stuck in their batch ETL mode, right?
Yep.
How do we take them and move them forward towards real-time analytics based on data change events? How do we then get back office IT and dig into the ERP systems and all of those things to make them not only event generation sources, but also event consumers, right? So the first step in the broader evolution is strategy. The second step is change management. And I'll say with that, and alongside with that, a broader architectural solution that serves across the board.
Yeah.
Then we can get into specific tech.
Yeah, I mean, in event driven architectures, and we talked about observability, but it's it gets crazy to the point when you have to think about all of the security, and not to put us down another rabbit hole with security, but all of the security that needs to happen with that, and all of the threat response that needs to happen after one of these events gets kicked off and gets and kind of cascades its way through the system. And I think, to your point, it's really about a cultural shift in a lot of different places, so everyone's kind of under the same understanding of what this means and what it means to have all these events. Because I think about it, it's like kind of like you start drinking from the fire hose, and if you can't intake it, and then everything starts cascading out, what does that look like? And
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really good point, because the other challenge, there's a organizational structure challenge and an organizational capability challenge. It's not just generic change management, but it's how are your team structured? What skills do they need? And one of the ones that I think probably hasn't been given enough voice recently is the changing role of architecture.
mm-hmm.
So if you scroll back the clock 8-10 years, it was pretty clear. You had application architects, you had infrastructure architects, you had security architects, you had enterprise architects, and they generally had fairly clear boundaries on their roles, right? The infrastructure architects were in charge of the data centers and making sure that things were cabled right, and we had the servers in there, and we had all of those things. The security architects, they had your edge SSO and your identity management systems and the redundancy around those, and your firewalls and all of that stuff. Your enterprise architects were looking across kind of everything and doing asset management and planning around that. And your application architects were responsible for building your systems that ran inside your infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as people are going to the cloud, that's changed because no longer is security and infrastructure something that happens alongside but separate from the application development, right? Oh, I'm building this app. I have to talk to your, identity provider and get a token back. And I have to make sure there's a hole in the firewall for people to come to the website through, right? Now it's like, well, I'm going to publish this event. And oh, by the way, we've got a rich partner network, and we have partners who are interested in some of these events. So how do I make sure the right events go to them, but the wrong events don't? How do I secure that? How do I ensure I don't have an accidental data breach there, right? Oh, by the way, where does this event bus live? Well, it lives on Amazon. Well, who's in charge of architecting that? Well, guess what? The solution architect is, maybe with some support from people who are security specialists and infrastructure specialists on AWS. But what we're finding is that this concept of solution architecture has been transforming with the cloud, and they're now responsible for not just the application and its scalability and reliability, but the infrastructure and security throughout the entire system, because there's multiple points of potential failure from a security perspective throughout the system. So that's another change that organizations need to kind of really be looking at is how do I transform my view of architecture and the skills of my architects in this new world?
Yeah, and then also to add on all the AI and ML architecture.
Oh, absolutely.
Into it, and having those kind of those fail safes and making sure that what doesn't happen, like what happened at Zillow, where they utilized a bad algorithm from Facebook, and then they started buying up all of the houses and and almost collapsed an entire company. I mean, you got to think about that, is that the more trust we put in AI as well, that opens up a Pandora's box to where, right, hey, that could cause a whole cascading set of events. That is hard to stop. So
yeah, and again, even in AI ML, there is, in every one of these, there are people who are specialists, who are experts in that particular skill set and field. But you also have the generalists who have to look at it and say, oh, I need to make this happen, right? So I've got one group of people who are looking at, I need to build a model that does a certain thing. And I have another group who are looking at it saying, I need to make this model run at scale. I need to figure out how to feed it data, make sure the right data is going to it in real time, all of these different things. So, that's the other aspect I'd kind of tell people to think about when you're thinking event-driven systems, especially when you're thinking about it as a corporate-wide evolution. There's a lot of knowledge, right? So strategy number one, how are you going to get there? What are the small steps you're going to take near term? What are the investments you're going to make to set yourself up to be successful? What architecture skills do you need to make it happen? What data management skills do you need to make it happen? You know, a lot of questions that need to be answered before you even get to the point of saying, let's make it, let's do it.
Yeah, and I think, to your point before, is you got to stay adaptable. And I just, even every time that we read the updates on AWS each week, I just think about, last week you could have been doing something totally different in your architecture and your plans, and now this week there's a new, better way to do it. And it's, it's definitely can be daunting on how do you prioritize that, and how do you focus on the things that are going to be effective long term. And you can try to look ahead on AWS's roadmap as much as you can, but I think it all comes down to just keeping it simple and trying to leverage the ability to make things modular. And I think obviously event driven architectures really help you be able to do that. And I think I shared one time just kind of an evolution of starting in the cloud, and whether it's on-prem and then to like K8s, the managed K8s, to and then the last one was event and service full was the way they described it. So I think to kind of wrap that in one is that event driven is not going away in any way, but it does have to have its place, and there still has to be different I guess kind of fail safes across the architecture. And to your point, it can get daunting to all of the skills that you really need to understand as a solutions architect these days. So you're not setting your architecture up to where it can quickly go bad. So with great power
Right.
comes great responsibility, I guess. So.
Yeah. Well, and it's an interesting, another interesting observation is I've had a lot of conversations recently about testing and AWS Lambda,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one of the interesting things that has come out of these conversations is this question of unit tests. How much unit testing do we really need to do, right? And I'm sure there'll be a whole bunch of people who'll respond to me and say, you always have to unit test. It's the right way to do things. And I agree. Unit tests are very important. But when your code base gets really, really small, your unit tests become very, very small as well.
Mm-hmm.
When your code base is very large and you've got a large monolith, those unit tests become very, very important. But if I have a small enough piece, if my Lambda in and of itself is what I would consider a unit, my unit test is actually a functional test of the Lambda.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing applies in architecture. So in the old days, an application architect was responsible for defining the monolith. How does this monolith work? How are we going to handle threading and parallel processing within the monolith? How are we going to segregate different modules? How are we going to do domain modeling? How are we going to do persistence management? How are we going to do all these different things? Because it's very complex. And the bigger that monolith gets, the more complex it is. As we go towards leveraging serverless technologies and microservices and breaking things up into different components that run independently from each other, the role of the application architect starts to fade into the background.
Mm-hmm.
It now becomes something that a good senior or principal developer can do, right? And you would expect them to do, because now the problem sets become really small, and the architecture work is not necessarily inside the piece of code, but it's just outside it, and all these different pieces of code get managed, deployed, secured, all of that.
How they all integrate together. And
Yep.
yeah, I think to your point is that it's definitely a shift of the skills that you need to know. And I even just think about data science as well, and just it's really shifting now about how do you actually deploy this into production. And to circle back kind of to what you said before, is how do we link that together in a product team into where we're making sure that we're able to push out products that are actually able to scale and to be implemented into the overall architecture. in the future. And I guess, we're coming, we got about 10 minutes here
Yep.
left. I wanted to also talk about maybe some specific technologies. And, I always asked you about step functions and some of the choreography challenges that it helps overcome. So how does step functions kind of play into the event-driven architecture and some of the problems that it helps solve?
So, so step functions, you know, in its simplest way is a workflow tool,
Hmm.
right? It allows you to do, and what's really nice is it could be a pure orchestration tool from kind of a SOA perspective, or it could be truly a workflow tool because you can use it to go out and say, I need to trigger that somebody does something, a person, a human being, before I pick up and continue with my work.
Hmm.
So where step functions can come into play is when I need to truly orchestrate certain things as part um, of responding to an event or something like that. So I could kick off a flow in step functions using an event, and that flow could invoke a lambda. It could invoke a second lambda. It could put something on an SQS queue and wait for a response. It could call an API. So I can coordinate and choreograph the things that need to happen. But the thing to remember is the definition of who has to do what when is part of your step function definition,
Hmm.
not part of the actors in that flow. So that's a centralized model. And again, not saying centralized models are bad. They are good and they're needed in the right places. But
Hmm.
finding the right balance, right? If I know that I need to do these things in these orders and there's a couple of things I could do in parallel, step functions are a great tool for that. But they do have a little tighter coupling because if I want to add something in there, I have to go modify my workflow to bring something into it. I have a single point, hopefully, where I have to modify that workflow, but I still have to modify the workflow.
Hmm. Hmm. So it kind of marries in the events and ties it back into a centralized control center essentially.
Yeah. And the trick here is always if it's rare that you'll ever find a system that's 100% event driven, or especially now in the cloud, 100% centrally controlled,
Hmm.
right? The trick is finding the balance. What is the right balance, right? So I could create an event that triggers a step function flow, right? And then it goes and does these things. And then I realize there's a few more things I need to do. So I could add them to those step functions. And there's a couple other things I need to do, but I could do it in parallel. So I can fork and I can do those in parallel in the step function and a few other, and I could keep growing that step function piece. But now I'm kind of creating a monolith again, right? And what you might find is there are spots where that specific step function flow should just release another event and let other step function flows trigger from it. All right. It looks like we may be having technical difficulties and may have lost John temporarily, but it's almost time to wrap up anyway. So I believe I will take that and I will wrap up. So thank you all for joining us today. Just a quick reminder, next Monday is a holiday. We will not be having a show, but we will be back on the week after. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe and like what we've published, and join us in 2 weeks for our next fun topic. Thank you.